Thank you. Here we go. The book of Genesis opens with God telling us that in the beginning He created the heavens and the earth. The Bible ends with the book of Revelation that tells us that God is going to destroy this present earth and the present heavens and create a new heaven and a new earth. Between Genesis and the creation account and Revelation, the new creation account is God's history of the earth. Prior to the creation, we call that era eternity past. We know very little about it. We know God existed. We know the angels existed because they shouted for joy when God created the heavens and the earth. We know that from the book of Job. But we don't know very much else. And we don't know a whole lot about eternity future. God's going to create a new heaven and a new earth. And those of us who know Christ as our Savior are going to be headquartered in this gorgeous thing called the New Jerusalem. And we're going to go off into eternity future ruling nations, but we don't know the nature of it. We really don't know a lot about eternity future or eternity past. But between Genesis and Revelation, we have God's history of the earth. And that's what we're examining now, and we will, Lord willing, be examining over the next 12 to 18 months. The Bible is a glorious history of what God has done. There's a lot of history that is also factual that we don't learn about in the Bible, but we're going to be focusing on what God has to tell us. And what you see here is a bare bones timeline of that history from creation to the new creation. Now, history, let me rephrase that. Christianity is rooted in history, a history that will have taken place on this planet and in particular places on this planet. Most of the Old Testament was played out in the Middle East, in Egypt, where the children of Israel spent 400 years growing from a family of 70 or 75 to a family of 2 to 3 million. And the Sinai had a part to play in that because they wandered around there for 40 years. And then, of course, there is the land of Israel. The land of Israel, if you just want some landmarks, is the land pretty much between the Mediterranean Ocean and the Sea of Galilee and the Jordan River and the Dead Sea. Also playing a major part in this history is Mesopotamia. The word Mesopotamia means the land between the rivers, and it's the land between and around the Tigris and the Euphrates River and rivers. And if you have a hard time remembering which is the Tigris and which is the Euphrates, I gave you a clue last week. What is that?
There's tigers in India.
If you keep traveling east, you'll go to India. You get a lot of tigers, so that's the Tigris. You're saying, well, that's sort of a dumb way to have to remember it. That's the way I remember it. But then you know how dumb I am, so we'll live with that. So, and in the land of Mesopotamia, there are a number of cities that played a big part in Israel's history. In the very beginning of, almost the beginning of Genesis, chapter 12 from Genesis, God called a man named Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, told him to go to the land of Canaan. And He was going to give him the land of Canaan, make of him a great nation, bless the world through him. Abraham left the land of Ur, which is southern Mesopotamia. And incidentally, this is modern-day Iraq. He went to the land of Canaan. There was no Jerusalem or Samaria at the time. And he had a son Isaac. Isaac had a son Jacob and Esau. Esau sold his birthright for a bowl of porridge. And Jacob had 12 sons, one of whom was wonderful. His name was Joseph. And we all know the story of how he was sold into slavery. He went down to Egypt, and eventually the whole family left for Egypt. They spent 400 years there. They came out, wandered around the Sinai, then went in and conquered the land of Canaan. And then they had a period of judges and a period of united kingdom under King Saul and David and Solomon. Then the kingdom was divided. And they were very, very wicked. God punished them. He punished the northern kingdom when He brought the Assyrians against them. The Assyrians came and conquered the northern capital of the capital of the northern kingdom called Samaria. And then the Babylonians conquered the Assyrians, and the Babylonians came down and conquered Jerusalem in the southern kingdom because of their incredible wickedness. It essentially took the entire population back to Babylon. And then the Persians came and conquered the Babylonians. A lot of wars, Wars, there have always been wars. And let the children of Israel return. And following the return, they rebuilt the city, rebuilt the walls, rebuilt the temple, rebuilt the walls around Jerusalem, and the Old Testament closes. We pick up the New Testament, we find that everybody's speaking Greek. Why? Because the Greeks under Alexander the Great came over and conquered the Persians. When the Old Testament closed, the Persians were in charge of Israel. And but then the Persians, the Greeks kind of faded after giving everybody the Greek language. The whole civilized world fell in love with the Greek language and Greek culture. And then the Romans took over after the Greeks faded. So you have a number of Gentile nations that play a part in Israel's history. Egypt and Israel and the lands in Mesopotamia in the Old Testament, and then Turkey, Greece, and Italy in the New Testament. Now, one of the reasons all of this is important is because Christianity is unique among religions. Most religions are born out of the minds of deceived men and women. Christianity is born out of history. And you say, why do we have to learn all this history? Because that's how you learn about Christianity. This timeline, this bare bones timeline, is in effect a summary of how the Judeo-Christian religion came into being. Lots of religions spring from the minds of men. For example, in the 6th century BC, a man named Siddhartha Gautama, a man who grew up in what is today called Nepal, went out into the field, found a tree, sat under the tree for 40 days and 40 nights. When the 40-day and 40-night sojourn under that tree ended, he got up and said, I've reached nirvana. I have found enlightenment. I'm saved. His name after that was called Buddha, which means the enlightened one. And a religion called Buddhism, which has enslaved hundreds of millions of men and women since the 6th century BC, is a religion born out of a man who sat under a tree for 40 days and 40 nights. You say, you're joking. I ain't joking. Don't ever underestimate how easily people are deceived. At the root, we're depraved and easily deceived. This whole religion was born out of his mind. 40 days, 40 nights under a tree. Fast forward to 600 AD. A man named Muhammad believed that God was giving him enlightenment and instructions over a period of 22 years. His name Muhammad, and what do we have? A religion called Islam. Born out of the mind of a man named Muhammad. Go to the 18th century, the 1800s in the United States. There was a man named Joseph Smith who believed that the angel Moroni gave him special instructions about where to find some gold tablets in which God had written down his instructions about the full gospel, the fullness of everlasting gospel, he called it. And out of that was born a religion called Mormonism. Now we can go on and on and on, describing religions throughout history and throughout the world that were born in the minds of men and women. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that God didn't speak to men and women throughout Old Testament history and New Testament history. On this timeline from creation in about 4000 BC to the new heavens and a new earth, we have lots of men and women whom God spoke to. But to a large extent, the Judeo-Christian religion is born in history, which is why I have this timeline up here, and we'll be going through it in detail over the next 12 to 18 months, and why you're constantly getting maps. It's a history, it's a religion born out of real events and the lives of real men and women in real geographical points on the globe. And that's unique to Christianity, but it's also kind of nice. For example, I don't have to ask a man who went up to a mountain and had a mystical experience about how the universe came into existence. In the book of Genesis, Moses gave us a history. Day 1, day 2, day 3, day 4. This is what happened. I know what happened to the human race. I know that God put Adam and Eve in a garden and they blew it. And how did they blow it? They ate the tree they weren't supposed to eat from. Well, what about salvation? I don't have to go to Guatemala, Siddhartha Gautama. I found out that in the third chapter of Genesis, God came down, talked to Adam and Eve, and says, one day a woman is going to bear a child, not a man. A woman is going to bear a child, and that child will redeem you. And that promise was made repeatedly throughout the Old Testament. And one day, God came to earth, seed of woman, not a man, no human father. And he grew to adulthood, and he allowed us to nail him to a cross, and on that cross, he took the penalty for our sins. I don't have to guess about our victory over death, because he got up 3 days later, and 500 people saw him. And there were 12 apostles who were kind of skeptical. Remember when Jesus he kept telling them, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to be buried, I'm going to rise on the third day. They said, yeah, but when are you going to set up the kingdom? We've been through this before. They weren't really interested in the cross. Not before the crucifixion. They were mostly interested in the Messiah setting up the kingdom and making them big shots. They're nice guys, but they're sort of like us. They were attracted to other things. And he got up out of the grave, showing that, in fact, he had conquered sin and death. That's exciting. I don't have to hope that some guy read the mountaintop spiritual experience correctly. I know from history what took place. And we can get into all the reasons why that is a very believable resurrection. We learn about the Judeo-Christian religion from history, and a history that took place at real geographical points on our globe. Now, there are two major sections of the Bible, and I have a few comments about the Bible in general, and then we're going to start working through the timeline and try to organize it for you so it'll be a bit more manageable. The Old Testament and the New Testament are the two major sections. Most of you know about this. The Old Testament begins with creation, and it ends with the rebuilding of the wall around Jerusalem. It goes from creation. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, Genesis 1:1. And it ends with the Jews returning from the Babylonian captivity, rebuilding the temple, rebuilding the wall. And then the Old Testament closes. The New Testament picks up about 400 years later with the announcements of the births of John the Baptist and Jesus. There's a 400-year gap in which the Bible, lots of history took place. Like, for example, Alexander the Greek conquered the Persians, and then the Romans conquered the Greeks. A lot of history, but we don't read about it in the Bible. There's a 400-year gap between the where the Old Testament ends and the New Testament begins. That's the reason there's nothing in that little line there. There's no line there. So the Old Testament begins with creation, ends with the rebuilding of the wall, following the Jews' return from the Babylonian captivity. The New Testament begins with the announcements of the births of John the Baptist and Jesus, and it ends with John writing the book of Revelation in about 95 A.D. The word testament means covenant. And the reason we call that first group of books the Old Testament and the second group of books we call it the New Testament is because the Old Testament contains the Mosaic Covenant. At the time of the Exodus, remember the Exodus, the family went down to Egypt, they stayed there for 400 years, and then God miraculously and spectacularly brought them out of bondage in Egypt. Well, that was a spectacular Exodus. And then they went to the Sinai, down the Sinai to Mount Sinai, and God made a covenant with the children of Israel. Moses went up on the mountain, God gave them the Ten Commandments plus a lot of other rules and regulations. And his deal with Israel was this: if you'll be obedient, I'll bless you. If you're disobedient, I'll curse you. Shall we make this contract? A covenant is a contract. And they said, yeah, let's do it. But they didn't do real well at it, did they? Which is why the night before Jesus, let's move over here, right? The night before Jesus was crucified, he said, you know what? I'm going to make a new covenant. The last one, that old covenant, that Mosaic covenant didn't work real well. The children of Israel didn't keep the rules and regulations. I'm going to make a new covenant. This time I'm going to write my law in your hearts. It talks about the new birth, the new nature, the Holy Spirit. So writing the rules and regulations on stone didn't work real well because we have old natures that just don't want to keep those rules and regulations. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to write my law in your heart. That's the new covenant. The reason we call that first 39 books the Old Testament is because it's, and incidentally, we were talking to Jews, don't call it the Old Testament. because they don't have a New Testament. You call it the Hebrew Scriptures. This is you learn that if you live in New York City. What do you mean? What do you mean it's Old Testament? There is only one, the Hebrew Scriptures. So the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament for us, is called the Old Testament, the Old Covenant, because it contains the Mosaic Covenant, and that last 27 groups of books contains the New Covenant. One day Jesus said, I'm going to make a new covenant with you. Okay. From a literary point of view, as I've already pointed out, the Old Testament contains 39 books, and the New Testament contains the last 27 books of the Bible. From a doctrinal point of view, the Old Covenant actually began in Exodus chapter 20, where God made the covenant with Israel, and the New Testament sort of began at Calvary. So interestingly enough, from a theological point of view, Jesus Christ lived essentially his entire life under the Old Covenant. Now, as a practical matter, we just have the Old Testament with the first 39 books and the New Testament with the next 27 books. But Jesus himself spent most of his life, essentially all, but maybe conceivably the last 10 days, while he was here on earth, living under the Old Covenant. In the broadest sense, the Old Testament speaks of Israel. As I pointed out several times, the first 11 chapters talk about creation, Adam and Eve in the garden, their sinning, the world becoming incredibly wicked, God destroying it with the flood. After the flood, the world basically repeated its rebellion under Nimrod. They built the Tower of Babel so they would not fulfill God's command to be fruitful and multiply and scatter, fill the earth. They said, no, we won't, we'll just stay here. So that's the first 11 chapters of Genesis. The 12th chapter of Genesis, God calls Abraham out of Ur of the Chaldees, makes him that great Abrahamic covenant. I'm going to make of you a great nation, give you the land of Israel, bless the world through you. And the rest of the Old Testament is about God fulfilling that promise. All the New Testament church age is just a little parenthetical section of God's history. Because what's going to happen one day, there's going to be a rapture, and following that's a tribulation period and a millennium when God's going to go back and fulfill the promises he made to Abraham. So the first 11 chapters deal with the world in general, but from the 12th chapter of Genesis, it's all about Israel. From the 12th all the way through. You're going to say, well, but there are these Gentile nations up here. The only reason God mentions those Gentile nations is because they had something to do with Israel. Those Gentile nations that have anything to do with Israel, you don't read about. All right. A little bit of miscellaneous information. The word Bible just simply means book. It comes from the Greek word biblion, which means book or roll. The word scriptures just simply mean writing. So we're talking about writings, we're talking about a book. The Bible is written over a period of 1,500 years. The first books were written by Moses. We date it from the time of the Exodus. And the last book written in the Bible was written by John, the Apostle John, in A.D. 95. While he was on the island of Patmos, he wrote the book of Revelation. So it was written over a period of 1,500 years. There are 66 books in the Bible, 39 in the Old Testament, 27 in the New. There are 40 different writers. And what's a joy as you work your way through the Bible, and one of the great supports for believing in the truthfulness of the Bible is that they're totally consistent. They all talk about a holy God who's responsible for ruling the universe, creating the universe and ruling it. They talk about the depravity of man, our need for salvation, the provision of salvation that God's going to provide in the atoning death of Christ. It's incredibly consistent. 40 writers over a period of 1,500 years, and in spite of what people say, there really are no contradictions. It was written in 3 languages: Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. The Old Testament, much of it was written in Hebrew and earlier forms of Hebrew. At the time of Christ, most of the Jews spoke Aramaic, so there was a bit of Aramaic tucked into it. And then most of the New Testament was written in Greek. So it was written over a period of 1,500 years by 40 different writers in 3 different languages, which makes it a little difficult sometimes to translate. Now, 66 books of the Bible tell us about that great story that I've laid out on that timeline for you. 66 books can be a little bit difficult to handle. You want, I mean, part of our goal here is not only to tell the story that timeline laid out for us, and of course a little bit more detail than was on the timeline, but you need to memorize that timeline because everything we're going to be talking about fits into there. Also, the 66 books fit into there. But handling 66 books can be a little bit daunting. So what God has done is He's very graciously divided it up into groups of books. The Old Testament can be divided up into 4 groups of books. The Pentateuch, which is the first 5 books. Penta means what? 5. And so it's and tuch comes from the Greek word tuchos, which means volume. So it's a 5-volume book. Then there are the books of history, then the books of poetry, and the books of prophecy. The New Testament can be divided also into 4 groups of books. The books of biography, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The books of history, only 1, book of Acts. Books of doctrine, there are 21 of them. We sometimes call them epistles. These were letters that the apostles wrote to different folks and laid out for us the great doctrines of the faith. And then there's 1 book of prophecy called the book of Revelation. These are the books: Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. The books of history, Joshua through Esther. All this is in your notes. The books of poetry, Job through Song of Solomon. And then there are the last group of books in the Old Testament, the books of prophecy. And there are 17 books, 16 different writers. The reason for there being 1 book more than there are writers is because Jeremiah also wrote the book of Lamentations. He wrote the time of Israel's destruction by the Babylonians, and he wrote about it in the book of Jeremiah, and Lamentations is the book he also wrote, and that's his lament, a weeping over the destruction of Jerusalem, which is why he's called the weeping prophet. Now we divide these 17 books into 2 groups, the major prophets and the minor prophets. The only reason there is this division is because the major prophets are just bigger, and so we call them major. The minor prophets just have less material. It's not because one group is more important than the other. The 4 groups of New Testaments are the books of biography, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Each of these writers wrote a biography of Jesus. So if you want to understand the life of Christ, you've got to put all 4 of them together. Book of Acts tells us about the history of the early church. The books of doctrine, 21 of them. We've examined some of those, and Lord willing, we'll examine a few others. And then there's 1 book, the last book of the Bible, a book of prophecy, the book of Revelation, which is probably the most important book of prophecy in the Bible. So these are the 4 groups of Old Testament books, the 4 groups of the New Testament books, all of which can be a little bit difficult to handle. So what I'm going to do now is focus on the Old Testament for a few minutes and show you how these books, these groups of books, fit into the Old Testament timeline. Okay? Any questions thus far? Good, because I probably couldn't answer. Now, the first group of books in the Old Testament are the first 5 books, called the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Notice I'm still counting on my fingers. I never get beyond the first grade. The Pentateuch, from 2 words, Greek words. Penta meaning 5, and tuch from the Greek word tuchos, which means volume. The Pentateuch was originally 1 book. It was 1 book written by Moses. And he wrote it probably in Hebrew or some early form of Hebrew. You say, well, how did it end up becoming 5 books? It was called, incidentally, the Torah. You ever see pictures of the Jews running around with the Torah scrolls? Well, technically, that's just the book of Moses, the first 5 books. Only Jews just call it the Torah, and sometimes they refer to the whole Old Testament as the Torah, but generally when they talk about the Torah or the book of Moses or the law or the Pentateuch, they're talking about the first 5 books. How did it end up 5 books? Well, let's fast forward to the time following the Jews returned from the Babylonian captivity. They rebuilt the temple, they rebuilt the wall, remember? Then Alexander the Great came over and conquered the Persians. We talked about that. And what happened was, when Alexander the Great conquered the Persians, he also conquered most of the Middle East and Egypt, and he introduced Greek culture to the civilized world. And the civilized world fell in love with Greek culture. God had a plan here. What God was getting ready for was the New Testament era in which he was going to take the gospel around the world. But he needed a language that all educated people could speak. Otherwise, every missionary would have to learn every new language and dialect. That would make it very cumbersome. So what God did was he raised up Alexander the Great to conquer the Persians, and then he introduced Greek culture to the civilized world so that when the time came for missionaries to go in the church age to tell the world about the gospel of Jesus Christ, every missionary could go to a new town or a new city and speak Greek to the educated people. Now, there may be a native tongue there that the common folk spoke, but he could always find someone who was educated and spoke Greek, because people fell in love with Greek culture. We're still in love with Greek culture. You take a philosophy course at any college and university, and you always start with which philosophers? Plato, Aristotle, the 4th, 5th century BC philosophers. We still love Greek culture. So it's not surprising they did. In any event, what happened was this. The Jews fell in love with Greek culture too. That's what gave rise to the Sadducees that Jesus had so much trouble with. Now, when they fell in love with the Greek culture, they said, let's translate the Hebrew Bible into Greek. And they did that a couple of hundred years before Christ, right back here. They translated the Hebrew scriptures into Greek. It's called the Septuagint. And when they did that, they said, this book of Moses, this Torah, this one book, that's too cumbersome. So let's break it down into 5 books. We'll call them Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So you with me? Good. Sometimes I wonder if I'm with me. Okay, so the first group of books is called the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And if you pick up the Pentateuch, read those 5 books, you'll get the history of the creation, the fall of Adam and Eve, the time after they left the garden and went out and populated the earth, and they became extremely wicked. You read about the flood that destroyed everyone but Noah and his family. You'll read about the events that followed the flood when Nimrod encouraged the people to follow him in building the Tower of Babel so they wouldn't scatter around the world as God had commanded. You'll read about, in the 12th chapter of Genesis, God calling Abraham out of Ur and sending off to Canaan and making him all those great promises. And you'll read about the family going down to Egypt and then coming out 400 years later at the Exodus under the leadership of Moses, wandering around the desert, wilderness, the Sinai, and then it stops, just as the children of Israel are ready to go into the land of Canaan to conquer it. Why did it stop there? Moses died. Simple. Had he not died, they probably would have written about the conquest. So the Pentateuch died here. It stopped here. It stopped as the children of Israel are encamped on the banks of the Jordan River, getting ready to cross that river and going and conquer the land of Canaan. Now, Moses wasn't allowed to go in because he had been disobedient. On one occasion, the children of Israel needed water. And God says, I want you to strike that rock. Boom! He did. And water gushed forth. And sometime later, they needed water again. The people, God was always testing the children of Israel, and they were always failing the test. Kind of like us. Nervous laughter out there. So God said to Moses, this time I want you to speak to the rock. But the people were giving him a hard time. It's one of those bad hair days. And so he got angry and he just popped that rock again. God said, man, you blew it big time. And because of that, you're not going to lead the children of Israel into the land of Canaan, which is why, just as they were getting ready to go, he died. Now you're going to say, what's the big deal? The big deal is this. Moses blew a great symbolism of the death, burial, resurrection of Christ and the life of sanctification for the believer. Let me explain what I mean. Jesus Christ is often called the rock, right? Now, how many times did Jesus Christ have to be struck on the cross to wash away our sins? Once. So that rock was a symbol of Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ only had to be struck once to give us the water of life. only struck once to shed his blood to wash away our sins. Now when I sin, Christ doesn't have to be crucified again for my sins. Now I simply ask my Father forgiveness. That's what God was getting at when he said to Moses, the next time they need water, just speak to the rock. So the first time the rock has to be struck, speaking of Christ dying, the next time you only have to speak to the rock. Speaking of sanctification, speaking of how we only need to ask forgiveness. Christ doesn't have to die over and over and over and over again. This is this beautiful symbolism. God was not happy with Moses. Now, that doesn't mean he's cast to hell. I mean, he's still going to be a monumental figure, maybe even during the time of the tribulation. But at any point, Moses wasn't allowed to go in to conquer the land of Canaan. He died right at this point. So the Pentateuch tells us about creation, the fall, the flood, the Tower of Babel, the family of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the family going to Egypt, the Exodus, wandering around in the wilderness. It ends when the children of Israel are encamped on the Jordan River, ready to go in and conquer the land of Canaan. They went under the leadership of Joshua. And Joshua is the first book in the historical books. And Joshua, Judges, Ruth, let me go back. Here we are. So the Pentateuch ended, the children of Israel are ready to go into the land of Canaan. The books of history are Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther. Now, if you read those 12 books, you will read the history of Israel from the time they're on the banks of the Jordan River, ready to go in and conquer the land of Canaan, up until the time they rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. In the book of Joshua, we read about the conquest. In the book of Judges, you read about the 350 years they lived under a series of judges. In the books of history, 1st and 2nd Samuel, you read about the reigns of Saul, David. And then in Kings and Chronicles, you read about Solomon. You read about the time, about the division of the kingdom. We went through this last week, or our last session together. When Solomon died, his son Rehoboam took over the throne. And the people came to him and said, hey, your father Solomon, remember, has been taxing us very heavily. He's been conscripting us into forced labor for his big building projects. Lighten up! His son Rehoboam said, nah, I'm going to be even worse than my father. And the people said, drop dead. And so the 10 northern tribes just bugged out and formed their own nation under a man named Jeroboam. It was politically dumb, wasn't it? He lost half of the 3/4 of his kingdom. So for the next 200 years, there is a period in Israel's history we call the time of the divided kingdom. The 10 northern tribes began as a nation under the rule of Jeroboam, who set up golden calves. He's called the man who taught Israel to sin. They had 19 kings. All of them were wicked. And the nation got worse and worse and worse. They became so idolatrous that God raised up the Assyrians to come and conquer them in 722, and they ceased to be a nation. The southern kingdom was also wicked, but not quite as wicked. They had 8 good kings. They also had 19 kings, same number in the north and south. But in the south, at least of the 19, 8 were good, 2 were excellent. King Hezekiah and Josiah. And as a result, they kind of delayed the extreme wickedness a little bit, but they still got very wicked. So God raised up the Babylonians to conquer the 2 southern tribes, the southern kingdom, and the Babylonians basically took the entire population back to Babylon. For 70 years, they returned because the Persians conquered the Babylonians. We've talked about this before. And they returned and they rebuilt the wall around, rebuilt the temple. And then 60 years later, they rebuilt the wall. And that's when the Old Testament ends, right there. If you keep reading your Bible, you're going to pick it up and say, well, the next section is the New Testament. And you read about the announcements of John. The angels came to announce the birth of John the Baptist and Jesus. We have 400 silent years. Now, if you read the Pentateuch and the historical books, you get the entire history of Israel. From creation up to the time they've returned from the Babylonian captivity to rebuild the wall around Jerusalem. But you say, wait a minute, we've got a lot of books left. That's true. We have the books of poetry and the books of prophecy. Now let me talk a little bit about the books of poetry and the books of prophecy. Poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. Why? Why books of prophecy? What you have in the Pentateuch and historical books is the history of the world from creation up until about 400 BC. And you have this history as it would be told by a historian. You have the nuts and bolts of history. Names, dates, places, events. Who, where, what, when. Who? Abraham. Where? Ur of the Chaldees. When? 2000 BC. What? Get out of here. Go to Canaan. That's good history. And if you read the Pentateuch and the historical books, you get the nuts and bolts of the history. But there's more to history than nuts and bolts of dates, names, places, right? What you want to know about what was going on in the hearts and the minds of the men and women who lived in all those years. That's a lot of history there. What was going on? What were their dreams? What were their aspirations? What were their disappointments? What were they excited about? What were they frustrated about? And that's what God called on poets. Poets don't ignore history, but that's not their preeminent concern. When I say a poet, I'm using it in the Greek sense. To the Greek, the poet was the playwright. They didn't have novels, but they'd have a lot of plays. He was a playwright. He wrote about the frustrations, the anxieties, and the dreams and aspirations and failures and despair of human beings. They didn't have novelists, but they had epic poems, which were the forerunner of novels. Poets are the men and women who are preeminently concerned with the human condition. Men and women of letters, playwrights, novelists. These are men and women who are interested in the human condition. So what God did was, after he had Moses write the Pentateuch and a bunch of guys write the books of history, he says, now I want to tell you about the hearts and minds of the men and women who lived during all of those years. And so he called on the poets, and we have Job. Oh, he wrote this epic poem about suffering, and he really suffered. And then we have the book of Psalms, which is about praising God. By half of them, almost half of them, 73 of the 150 were written by King David. And much of the time he's praising God. But a lot of the time he's just frustrated living in a fallen world. You ever get frustrated? You kidding? And our life is better than most people's lives. So what the poets did was they wrote about that. And then they had Song of Solomon writing about love, and Proverbs about wisdom, and Ecclesiastes, which is the earliest book on existentialism. The French think they invented existentialism. They didn't. Solomon did. Basically, the point of Ecclesiastes was, what if you could take the smartest man on the planet, give him incredible wealth and power, and send him out to find something worthwhile in this world apart from God? And guess what? He couldn't find anything worthwhile, which is the reason the book opens up with vanity of vanities, meaningless meanings. There's nothing out there of value. So God called on the poets to go back and tell us about the events that had taken place. If you read the Pentateuch and the historical books, you have the whole history, the nuts and bolts of what took place in the Old Testament era. Then you go to the books of poetry, Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and you learn about the heart and minds of men and women who lived during those years, the heart and minds. And you can empathize. Read the Psalms. You know, David was often just frustrated. It was difficult. David did his best to be a good king, but there are always those critics throwing stones. He would go out and try to do something good, fall on his face. Now, maybe that may not happen to any of you, but you know what that's like. You know what love is like, what frustration is like, what desire is like, what disappointment's like. If you've never been disappointed, you haven't been alive. Hello, and there's anyone breathing. And so it's important. This is the one thing I love about these guys. When I get frustrated, I read up the poets. I don't read the history. I know the history. I want to read a guy who's as frustrated and angry and despair-filled as I am. So read the poets. Now we still have one group of books left. Isaiah through Malachi, a bunch of them. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, then Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, all the way to Malachi. The books of prophecy. The books of prophecy were all written by men who lived after the time of the divided kingdom. So that's the reason I have this right here. The books of poetry, Job through Song of Solomon, were written by men who lived throughout this period. The books of prophecy, all of those, 17 books, 16 writers, were all written by men who lived after the time of the divided kingdom. And they tell us the one element that's missing. I've got the nuts and bolts in the history in the Pentateuch and historical books. I've learned from the books of poetry about the hearts and the minds of men and women who lived during those years. But there's one piece missing. What's that? What? The hearts and minds of God. Thank you. You read the notes. No. She knew that already. The heart and mind of God. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that if you read the Pentateuch and historical books, you would not know something about the heart and mind of men and the heart and mind of God. But the truth is, if you want to learn a lot more about what was going on in the heart and minds of men, you read the books of poetry. And in the books of prophecy, you really learn a lot about the heart and mind of God. You remember those plays? Most of you probably had a literature course in college, and they talk about those plays where in the middle of the play, everything stops. And one of the actors comes out into the stage center and gives a thing called a soliloquy. A soliloquy in which he sort of shares with you and the audience what's going on. Those people back there, they don't know what's happening. It's like, let me tell you what's going on at this point in the play. He comes out and he starts talking and tells you what's on his heart and his mind. That's what the books of prophecy are about. Every so often, I just want to hear from God. I don't want to hear from men. I get that on the evening news. After you're up to here and that, you want to say, I just want to hear from God. And the books of prophecy are filled with that. The books of prophecy are a lot of books in which God says, let me tell you, Dave, what's going on. And let's reason together, Isaiah. Let's reason together. And he tells us what was on his heart and mind during all those years. He tells about his dreams for the people. He had tremendous dreams for the Israelites. He had this glorious future plan for them, a future he is in fact going to fulfill for them one day. He also tells us about his disappointment with the Israelites, because even though he raised them up from Egypt, delivered them miraculously, took care of them every day in the desert, did he not? Every day he got up 6 days a week. There's manna to eat. They could see him, pillar of cloud by day, pillar of fire by night. We live in a world full of people. I'd believe in God if I could see some evidence of his existence. The children of Israel saw evidence of his existence every minute of every day for 40 years. How obedient were they? They weren't. God is saying, what's wrong with you? That's what he talks about. If you want to know what the books of prophecy are about, is what's wrong with you? Let's reason together. Look at all the evidence for my existence. Haven't I shown you how much I love you? I'm like a mother loving a child. I would never forget you. And what are they doing? Give us another God. Give us another God. He was frustrated with that. Now, I know God may not. Some argue about God can get frustrated, but you get the sense in the books of prophecy. He was disappointed. He loved these people. They were precious to him. They'll always be precious to him. But he was also very frustrated with them because no matter what he did, they were incredibly disobedient. And so you go to the books of prophecy and you learn about that. The books of prophecy, when we think about the books of prophecy, sadly, I have to back up here a minute. Sadly, people think of them as books in which God is foretelling events, and he does. But that's not really what the books of prophecy are about. If you read through those 17 books, most of it, like 90% of it, has nothing to do about the prophet predicting what's going to be happening years to come. Most of what they did was just talk about what was going on at that moment in time. Let me sort of help you understand that a little bit, if I can get my machine here working. Here we are. Now, let me explain what a prophet is. You need to understand what a prophet is. When Adam and Eve were in the Garden of Eden, God, we're told, came down every evening in the cool of the day, and Adam and Eve and God would walk together in the cool of the day. Just buddies. That had to be incredibly exciting. God would come down, let's talk about today. They'd named some more animals, it's about this name, that name. They had a grand old time. But then what happened? Adam and Eve were disobedient. All they had to do was not eat from one tree. That's all. It was not like that was the only tree. There were thousands. Thousands. Good stuff too. No ringworm, nothing. Just good fruit. Nothing sour. Nothing had been cursed yet. No wormholes in the apples. That's all they had to do. That's called sin, and it made a separation. People say it's a little thing. Let me tell you what, you're getting a little sense of God's holiness. He will not tolerate it. Isaiah said that our sins have made a separation between us and God. And that's what sin does. It separates us from God. Adam and Eve died spiritually. The word death means separation. When Adam and Eve sinned, they were immediately separated from God. God then kicked them out of the garden. He went up to heaven. He didn't come down in the cool of the day and walk with them anymore. They lost that. There's a sense in which God went up there, He's still there, and left us down here. Fortunately for us, He established a bridge between Himself and us. And that bridge is a bridge of three offices: prophet, priest, and king. Let me explain what these are. God doesn't come down any longer and talk with us in the cool of the day. But what He did do was this. He says, I'm not going to disconnect myself from you, but what I'm doing, I'm going to establish three offices that will be a bridge between myself and you. The first office is a prophet. Rather than coming down and talking with you or just opening up the sky every morning at 9 o'clock and shouting down instructions, I'm going to grab a guy over here. You're going to be Isaiah for a moment. I'm going to speak to Isaiah, and then Isaiah will speak to all of you. A prophet, very simple. Don't make it complicated. Is simply a spokesman for God. In the Garden of Eden, before they sinned, God could come down and be His own spokesman. But they sinned, and sin separated man from God, right? And the only hope to reestablish that bond that was lost is through the shed blood of Jesus Christ. But God says, I'm not going to completely separate from myself from you. I'm going to raise up men called prophets, and they're going to be my spokesman. The best definition for a prophet is a spokesman for God. And if you read through the books of prophecy, that's what those prophets are doing. God would see the Israelites doing something, usually sinning. He would say, okay, Isaiah, I want you to come here. I'm going to talk to you. Then you go talk to these sinners over here and tell them that I'm unhappy with what they're doing. And furthermore, I'm going to punish them if they keep doing it. So a prophet is a spokesman. God, a second leg in this bridge were kings. God continued to rule over mankind through kings. And the book of Romans, we just studied that several weeks ago. And in the book of Romans, we find out in the 13th chapter that God sets up all the rulers, does He not? So the idea that all these people think they got there on their own is not true. God says, I'm going to rule over you. I will set up kings. Now, often He gives us bad kings. Why? Because we're bad. That was the case with Saul. They said, we want a king, we want a king. He says, God, fine, I'll give you a king after your own heart. And He gave him a real turkey because their hearts were turkey-like. So, God and man were separated because of sin. God established a bridge in which He spoke to us through prophets. He rules over us through kings. And then He allows us to go back and approach Him through priests. When the children of Israel wanted to approach God, they didn't offer up their own sacrifices. They would bring them to the tabernacle and later the temple and bring their sacrifice to a priest who would then offer it up. So the bridge between man and God was a priest. So this is a sort of a three-legged bridge between God and sinful man. Originally wasn't necessary because God came down in the cool of the day and chatted with us, right? But sin separated us, so God says, I'm going off my heaven, you stay there on earth, but I'm going to establish a bridge between you and me. When I have something to say to you, I'm going to speak to prophets. Or Isaiah over here. And you go tell them what I have to say. And when you read through the books of prophecy, you find God speaking to prophets and prophets going out and talking to the people. I'm going to rule over you through kings. And when you approach me, you'll better approach me through a priest. The first thing you did with the priest was you brought a sacrifice. Interestingly enough, priests and kings couldn't be of the same tribe. Remember, kings were the tribe of Judah, priests were the tribes of Levi, because God didn't want the kings to have a corner on all this stuff, except for one person, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ has all three offices. He's a prophet, he's a priest, and he's a king. He's a prophet. Prophets spoke for God, right? And that's a simple, forget all that, don't have to forget, but get away from the idea that the whole point of a prophet was foretelling the future. I promise you, 90% of what prophets had to say had nothing to do with the future, had to do with right now. God is speaking to the people right now. He didn't open the sky and shout down, he spoke to a prophet. Okay, so Jesus Christ was also a prophet. In fact, he was such an incredible prophet that John tells us that he was called the Word of God. So you, Isaiah, you just speak the words of God. When Jesus came as a prophet, he was the Word of God. That's heavy. That's heavy. Secondly, Jesus isn't just the king of the Jews. He's going to be the king of Jews ruling the entire world. That's the reason he had to be the greater son of David. And then as a priest. Most priests, all the priests in Israel, were from the tribe of Levi, the family of Aaron. And every day they had to make morning sacrifices. Every evening they had to make evening sacrifices. Once a year on the Day of Atonement, they would go into the Holy of Holies with the blood from a goat that had been shed to atone for the sins of the people. But they had to do it over and over and over and over. Why? Because the book of Hebrews tells us that the blood of bulls and goats won't wash away your sins. But Jesus Christ, our priest, only made one sacrifice. In the fullness of time, he allowed us to nail him to the cross. And when we nailed him to the cross, he made one sacrifice for the sins of mankind. All the other priests offered up animals repeatedly. When it came time for our high priest, Jesus Christ, to fulfill his office as a priest, if he's a priest, you got to offer sacrifices for mankind, right? That was the whole point of a priest. People want to approach God, they got to approach him through the priest. They couldn't offer them up the sacrifices themselves. They had to go to the priest. Jesus says, I'll tell you what, as a priest, I'm just going to offer myself as a sacrifice. And that's all that will ever be necessary. Is that thrilling? So, when we talk about the books of prophecy, we will talk about, when we start working our way through them, we will talk about some of the predictions they made. We will talk about some of the future events that they spoke about. Some in the distant future, some in the more immediate future. But mainly what you want to think about when we talk about these prophets is you want to think about them as men who spoke for God. Men who spoke for God, because that's really what they're doing. So, we have, if I can find my place again. So men should just stay with overheads. Yeah. Here we are. Okay, here we are. So, all we've talked about thus far is the Old Testament. The Old Testament. We can read the book of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. The books of history, you have the entire history of the Old Testament as laid down in the Scripture, from creation to the rebuilding of the wall, following the Jews' return from the Babylonian captivity. You read the books of poetry, and you learn about the hearts and the minds of men and women who lived during those years. And that's wonderful to find out about their frustrations and desires. You're not the only one that's frustrated. You're not the only one who's disappointed. You're not the only one who's excited. And you're not the only one that falls into despair. The Old Testament's filled with men who went through those emotions. And in the books of prophecy, Isaiah through Malachi, we read about what was going on in the heart and mind of God. He tells us about his desires for the people, his frustrations with the people. But he's also telling us about his great hopes for the people. And the hope is that a hope that will be fulfilled during the millennium when Jesus Christ is going to come to earth, sit on the throne of David, rule the world in righteousness, and all that we see that's so wrong with the world today will end. These then are the 4 groups of books in the Old Testament. Next week, we'll pick up and look at some of the groups of books in the New Testament. Our time is up. Let's pray. Father, we love you. We worship you. We thank you for being our God. We thank you for this wonderful book. I pray, Father, that we'll embrace it the way we ought to, and that it will be a real light to our feet. I pray, Lord, that it will be real nourishment to our souls. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.